And it goes something like this. Well, Father, all that religion stuff is nice, but really, I just want my kid to get a good SAT score. Jesus is a mascot, but it's not the important work. And honestly, that's not what I'm paying for.
I think that's probably the vast majority of parents sending their kids to Catholic schools across the country. The response over time has to be, Jesus isn't just a mascot. Jesus is the unum necessarium. He's the one thing necessary.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, that may hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Friends, I'm old enough to remember when you connected to the internet through a dial-up modem, and big tech was and social media, that they just weren't a thing. We're in very different times now. We have to ask about the influence of big tech, not only socially, but politically and even economically. I'm going to ask this question: is big tech trying to play both sides? My expert guest today is Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project, Jon Schweppe. Welcome to the Catholic Current.
Thank you so much for having me, Father.
John, my mentor in philosophy, Dr. Paul Weiss, said the trouble that most people make with bribery is they make this mistake. They don't make sure that there's enough for everyone. Is big tech simply doing bribery right, making sure that there's plenty for the left, plenty for the right, plenty for the conservatives, plenty for the Republicans? Help me to understand, what is your concern here? What are you seeing in your research?
Well, we've found in our research that big tech has committed quite a bit of money, so not just to direct lobbying of Congress and the White House and various other agencies, but to these think tanks and organizations out here in D.C., both on the right and the left. And, if somebody was going to have enough money to fund everybody, it would be, $2 trillion valuation tech companies like Google and Amazon and Apple. And that's what's kind of happened. I mean, we've seen certainly over the last decade, but it's increased in more recent years, these companies giving just tons of money to the kind of intellectual ecosystem out here in DC, and it's kind of had an impact on how both Republicans and Democrats see these companies. They see them as generally good pillars of our economy, and so that's helped, through these think tanks, basically make the argument for why we should never touch them and we should never interfere with anything they're doing because they are such a big part of our economy now.
Well, it seems to me, there's wherever there's powerful people, there are people with money trying to influence the powerful people. So in a certain sense, that this has been a perennial issue. But I think that the scale and the scope and the pervasiveness and almost the inevitability of it all is very different. What kind of money are we talking about here, first of all? I mean, it's more than just a couple $1,000s here, a couple $1,000s there. What kind of spending have you been finding in your research?
So it's been a little bit tricky because while some of the companies do disclose that they do give funding to certain organizations, they don't always disclose the numbers. So we've had to rely a lot on whistleblowers and, information from other sources and that sort of thing. So on our website where we catalog all this, bigtechfunding.org, we do not list the amounts. And the reason for that is just because, we weren't going to list something that we didn't have, a direct source that we could link to.
Thank you.
But
I
will tell
that.
you, we didn't want to traffic any rumor, but I will tell you that, from what we know, a very small donation to one of these smaller organizations would be like $50,000 a year. A median donation for a lot of the larger organizations that, have had a lot of influence out here. So on the left, it would be an organization like the Center for American Progress. On the right, something like the Heritage Foundation, which, by the way, I should say they don't take that money anymore, but they did for a long time. We're talking $250,000 to $1 million a year. And, for anyone who's ever done fundraising, fundraising is, when you work at a nonprofit organization, it's this really unfortunate thing you have to think about constantly because you want to be able to continue to do the good work you're doing. And so when you're talking those types of numbers, like, for example, I'm thinking of an organization, I won't say their name on air, but
Okay.
they have a $3 million budget and they get $250,000 a year from Google.
Oh,
That's a pretty sizable amount, and they're
yes.
going to do what they can to make sure that Google is happy with their work. And that's how big tech likes it. I mean, they are actually, even compared to some of the other corporations that fund groups out there, big tech is very much involved. They have their own public policy teams that kind of dictate to these groups what the prevailing talking point of the day is. So they're very hands-on, and it creates a kind of cacophony of pro-big tech talking points that reaches the halls of Congress and reaches the White House and, does have an impact, or at least has previously.
Friends, the question I'm addressing today is this: is big tech trying to play both sides? My guest is Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. John, I'm reminded of something that's taking place in Canada, that Canada has said, gosh, all those newspapers going out of business, that's a shame. And gee, all these independent news sources, all that legacy mainstream media, that's in financial distress. So the Canadian government, out of the goodness of their heart, using other people's money, of course, is going to give money to news outlets and to social media that wasn't able to make it financially on its own. That's just a purchase order, isn't it? At least in the Canadian context. Let's start with that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely, because unfortunately, it's just a human thing. While media, for example, I mean, these journalists, I don't doubt that they intend to be objective and all that, but when you have the money pressure on the side, like if your if you worked for a news outlet here in the U.S., then your parent company was involved in a scandal, you're going to feel real pressure not to report on them because you could lose your job, and so you have other considerations to think about there. So I think it's natural that anytime money is involved, it's going to create kind of perverse incentives for people who are otherwise acting, virtuously. And so I would argue that that's why we need the disclosures, because ultimately people just can't be relied on to just sort through that themselves and just be trusted to be earnest about all these things.
Well, I do know that some of the popular sources, if you discuss issues that the sources are concerned about, COVID as an arbitrary example, or voting integrity, they're already reassuring you, this is already a matter settled. Click here for more information. I don't want you reading over my shoulder. So I find that to be a problem as well. John, how about this? My take on it is, we'll just pick on Google, but it could be a number of them. They're multinational, really borderless entities with their own agendas and their own commitment and loyalty only to themselves. And so their concern, say, about American politics doesn't have anything to do with the good of America or Americans, but only their corporate self-interest. And we see that, for example, in the way big tech interacts with China, pretty much doing China's bidding because China pays a lot of bills. Is that too jaundiced a view of big tech? Are they really just a big player buying up governments for their own purposes, or is there a benign aspect that I'm missing?
No, I think kind of referring them as supranational entities is accurate because they've gotten very involved in elections, for example, right? And Facebook is an example of this, but there's a quote, and I'm using scare quotes here, far right party in Spain, the VOX party. And, Facebook's totally deplatformed them, like made it where they can't really participate in democracy. And Facebook, for a lot of nations, including the United States, I would argue, has become sort of the public square. So when you kick someone out and say they can't participate, they're basically asserting an authority larger than that of the United States government. You brought up China. Apple is very much involved in China, and there's been a couple exposés on this. I believe the New York Times had one a couple months ago where they've, basically allowed the Chinese Communist Party to surveil anyone who has an Apple product in China, including non-Chinese citizens. So it could be American businessmen over there would be having their data sent to the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, and this is a company here in the United States that claims to be focused on privacy. That's kind of Apple's big advertisement here in the U.S. So I think what you see is that these companies have become larger than life, and they have become truly global entities. And because of that, they view themselves that way because ultimately they don't want to lose. If Apple lost China's market share tomorrow, it would, severely depress their stock price. And so they have these weird considerations, and they want to make sure that they can compete globally.
I think what concerns me is that when you have very great powers, and by powers I mean not only individuals or governments, but technologies really available to the highest bidder without any accountability, it's inevitable given fallen human nature that you're going to have terrible mischief. And what makes it worse is that social media is so pervasive and it's also addictive. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation about big tech trying to play both sides. My guest today is Jon Schweppe, Director of Public Policy and Government Affairs for American Principles. The next segment, we're going to ask, what is big tech trying to buy? Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo, Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything you need to take the conversation to your family and friends, we give to you. Together, let's take it around the world. Be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us. This is Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your daily host of the Catholic Current. Join me on Tuesday at 5 p.m. Eastern when I welcome back attorney Liz Yor, a renowned children's rights advocate. We'll be talking about how current government policies facilitate human trafficking. The crisis at our borders is more than just a problem of numbers. Find out more on the Catholic Current at Tuesday, 5 p.m. Eastern, coming to you from the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
You're listening to The Catholic Current with Father Robert McTague from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. Our question today is this: is big tech trying to play both sides? My expert guest is Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. John, we always talk about follow the money. And it's said that if you want to know what people really value, see how they spend their money. In light of how you've been following big tech and their spending patterns in the political arena, what are they looking to buy? What are the strings attached to the money they're giving?
Well, I think, I'll try not to get too into the weeds on this, but it is important for your listeners to understand that there's kind of a tug of war over tech regulation policy right now. And it kind of comes down to speech on the internet. So conservatives especially have felt that their speech has been suppressed or censored by the big tech companies. I think there's plenty of examples of that being true, including my organization has been repeatedly censored. But the left, they are approaching this from a much different angle. They are concerned about what they deem to be misinformation, which I would argue is anything they disagree with. They want to, eliminate the ability, we heard it after the 2016 election, of Russian interference and that sort of thing. And so what they want to do is force the companies to regulate more and to censor more speech. And so the natural, situation these companies have been in is, okay, well, who's more of a threat? And so the more immediate threat, because Republicans, and I would argue because of the big tech money, because Republicans had largely been bought off for years, and I think we're just starting to get out of that. They saw the left as the bigger threat, and so naturally they responded to it. Okay, we'll censor more. Here's examples of that. We're removing this person and this person. We kicked President Donald Trump off the platform. We're removing everything that questions COVID-19 prevailing wisdom. And they've been trying to, in my opinion, kind of avoid regulation from the Democrats on that front. So what they're trying to buy is basically allegiance on both sides to stop either party from getting serious about going after big tech. Now, I will say, just real quick, the encouraging news is that there are, I would say, good people on both sides who have legitimate concerns about these companies. On the left, you have people who have kind of an ideological fear of too much concentrated power in one company. They see like Amazon shutting down small businesses and that sort of thing, and they see that as a negative. And then on the right, you do have people who are very concerned about what would happen to this country if half of us were silenced from the public square. But, you still have those moneyed interests that are pushing back against both of those coalitions. So.
And again, I'm certainly not a communications lawyer or a lawyer of any kind, but I know that one of the areas of discussion is, on the one hand, the big tech platforms say, hey, we're just carriers. We're like AT&T or Verizon, and you wouldn't hold us accountable if someone planned, say, a bank robbery using an AT&T phone. So we're not responsible. On the other hand, hey, we're publishers. We get to decide what's published, just like newspapers. Now, those are mutually exclusive positions, it seems to me, and they're claiming both at the same time. Is that an accurate summary of the state of the question?
I think that's very accurate, and that's where people talk about Section 230, which
right.
is, to make it short, a special privilege granted by the government to give these companies immunity from any civil liability for the content on their platforms. So like what you described. And I think, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like once you start censoring content systematically, you're endorsing the rest of your content by default. And so if they're doing that, then I think they should be liable for their content. And so that's where a lot of the Republican proposed fixes to Section 230 would make that immunity conditional on them actually being what they say they were, that they're these neutral platforms that just allow all the speech on their platform. And, you still want to create some carve-outs where they can go after like pornography and threats to violence and things like that. We don't want that on the platform.
Right.
But, they can make the distinction between, someone asserting that there's two genders and, someone threatening to bomb a building or something like that.
Right. I mean, I want to make clear, and I've spoken about this on the show with Michael Knowles. I'm an advocate for free speech by which I don't mean that there can't be any regulation, there can't be any common sense at all. That's never a wise or prudent position. But as I said, to say that only women give birth to children is somehow out of bounds, or hate speech is very different from let's blow up a bridge or vilify this group of people. So it seems to me you've got a number of large multinational corporations who have their own interests, and their primary interest, it would seem to me, is the rapacious pursuit of profit. And at the same, which by the way, rapacious pursuit of profit is not the definition of capitalism, but that's another topic for another time. Yet at the same time, the corporations seem to have. It seems to me that they've adopted a particular type of ideology as the preferred one. I mean, I have friends who work for Microsoft and for Amazon, and some of their personnel policies would make professors at UC Berkeley blush. They are so woke. And it puzzles me, because wasn't it the narrative, it certainly was the case when I was growing up, that corporations are big and bad and mean, and conservatives and liberals and progressives have to fight them to the death? What happened to that narrative?
Well, I think, and this could be a longer conversation about progressivism itself, but I think they were pretty smart. I think they saw all these institutions 50, 60 years ago that they didn't like, and they decided to go in and capture them. And so rather than, just being the kind of, I guess, the hippie mindset of just opting out and defying the man that way, they went in and became the man. And so now I think what we're seeing at these companies is, we've had progressive dominance of corporate America for at least a generation now, but you're seeing kind of the offspring of that. And so as this more, I would say, less liberal ideology, a much more authoritarian ideology of suppressing all speech they don't like, as that kind of takes over these companies, of course, it's going to affect their decision making. And you also have kind of a weird situation at the top where you might have people in the C-suite who are, maybe in their 40s. They're liberal, but they're not woke. And, they're actually afraid of their own employees because of the culture we live in. If you make one wrong move or say one wrong thing, you can lose everything in an instant because of social media and because of how powerful these movements are. So,
friends, the topic we're addressing today is big tech trying to play both sides. My guest is Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. Jon, let's dwell on that a little more. That the folks who've been at the helm of these progressively minded, very powerful, very influential corporations may have stirred up something that they can't control. When you said, for example, someone in the C-suites or someone in the corner office says the wrong thing seems to be very much a moving target. I mean, there are certain words that everyone knows you just can't say ever, ever, ever. But for example, the phrase sexual preference was fine until Amy Coney Barrett said it during a Senate hearing. And then the dictionaries literally changed overnight and it became hate speech. And I've joked with friends, maybe we need an app so that the forbidden words and phrases can be, you can get updates in real time. Is it inevitable that eventually that kind of wokeism runs out of the usual suspects and has to turn on itself?
Yeah, I think we've seen that throughout history. I would point to the French Revolution as a classic example of that. What we've seen is that if you look at the kind of advent of progressivism in America back with Teddy Roosevelt and even before FDR, Woodrow Wilson, progressivism, a feature of that ideology was, the pursuit of human perfection, right? That we are going to know things 20 years from now that we don't know now. We're going to have better science. We're going to have better philosophy. And so it's always the pursuit of the new and discarding of the past. But I think what's happened is that while that's always been a feature of progressivism, it's accelerated. And so now what we're seeing is, kind of a hyperinflation of ideas where I pointed this out to my wife last night. We were watching a sitcom from 10 years ago, and the jokes at the time, Hollywood is very left-wing dominated. It was, fine with the sexual culture of the time, and now there's no doubt it would be canceled today. It's far too offensive to transgender people or whomever, and I just think that that's what we're seeing. And so the question here is, as they accelerate, you would think that there would be a tipping point where they fail, and so I think that's where the American people have to stand up against this ideology, push back on it, and then hope that it ultimately does defeat itself.
Well, let's shift a little bit in terms of entertainment. There's been a lot of rebooting of classical brands for new and improved ideology. For example, the classic movies, the Ghostbusters, and then there was a female version of that, which flopped. There were the classic Star Wars franchise. And then recent ones have failed because rather than, the young male hero who has to fail and struggle and learn and go through apprenticeship, and then at the end of the movie becomes the hero, in the new and improved Star Wars, the girl just picks up the lightsaber and defeats a Sith Lord, and she's never been behind the wheel of the Millennium Falcon before, and she just boots it up and she goes and she beats people who were bred to be fighter pilots, etc. By and large, the public isn't buying it. Will the money eventually run out for woke entertainment and woke culture, or do you think this is going to drag on for a long time?
I think there's some early indicators that it will, because people just have so many entertainment choices now that they can, like cable, for example. We've seen cable numbers completely decline as people have cut the switch or cut the cord. And we're seeing the same thing with movies. Unfortunately, I think that's actually going to probably kill the movie theater industry. But ultimately, I think that they're just very much, we as Republicans always thought with our liberal counterparts in these institutions, yeah, okay, but they're never going to put their ideology over profit. And so we thought they wouldn't push, ideas that would prove to be unpopular and sacrifice profit in the process. But I think they are willing to do that. I think they've demonstrated. We actually see with woke capital and some of these investment firms a pursuit of, they call it ESG investing, which is basically like all of the progressive ideas in these companies. And it's clearly a way for shareholders to lose money compared to what they could be making. But I don't think that these elites care, these progressive elites care. They really do believe they're doing the right thing and are willing to sacrifice profit. So in that sense, this is almost a religion, I would say, or at least has a lot of features of a religion where
I would prefer the use of the word cult myself.
A cult might be a better
Friends, we come back.
Yeah.
We're going to continue our conversation with Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. We're talking about big tech trying to play both sides. In the next segment, we're going to look at it from a contrary point of view. Has big tech become the boogeyman? After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. Download it, follow on a channel, write a 5-star review. Let's attract the attention of the algorithms so these conversations get the attention they deserve. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. Our topic today is this: is big tech trying to play both sides? My guest is Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. John, I want to talk about an article that goes back to May. Robbie Soave, I apologize if I mangled his name.
I think.
Suave, and Reason magazine, and the title is "Both the Left and the Right Are Exaggerating the Threat Posed by Facebook," and the subtitle is "Facebook Can't Kill, Jail, or Tax You. It can only stop you from posting on Facebook." Since that time, you haven't said, "Oh, never mind, my bad." Why not?
Well, I do like Robbie, so I won't say anything too negative, although I will say that the organization he works for, the Reason Foundation, is on our list of receiving money from big tech, so that shouldn't necessarily be too surprising. But look, I think the problem with that argument is if you're thinking only in terms of the only bad thing that can happen to you in an authoritarian country is being jailed or imprisoned or killed, then yeah, I guess that's technically true. Facebook, Google, Amazon, none of these companies can do that to you. They can remove your ability to speak in the public square. They can deny your access to financial transactions, as PayPal and others are increasingly doing. They can, totally eliminate your ability to make profit from a business. They can defame your reputation and make it where it's impossible for you to get a job at any kind of corporation that has any sort of left-wing management whatsoever, which is all of them. So I would say that that's not necessarily true. I think that while they can't jail you, they can make your life extremely hard, and we've seen that with a number of people. And so, and ultimately there's other considerations too. Like our elections are almost sacred in this country. I mean, we really believe that our elections are not being interfered with by these moneyed interests, by rigging or whatever. And when you have companies like Facebook in particular, putting their thumb on the scale, deciding which political candidates are allowed to advertise and which aren't, deciding which ads are false and which aren't. And we had our super PAC, my organization, American Principles Project, we ran a super PAC ad saying that Joe Biden would support men competing in women's sports. And we actually had that ad removed. A fact checker said that we couldn't prove that it was false. And so that was, almost $100,000 of intended advertising in Michigan that we lost out on because of that decision by Facebook. And so obviously that has an impact. So I see I just completely disagree with his premise that the only thing bad that can happen, the only bad authoritarian power is that which can imprison you. There's other things that they can do.
Well, I want to give an example, and I've seen this a number of times that, someone says something intemperate in social media, and then it lies dormant for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and then the person becomes more prominent or more political or more famous, and someone digs up, a sophomoric illustration of humor or potty humor or something like that. But now it's the ultimate thought crime, and the person is vilified, shunned from polite society. There are a couple of cases where people ended up committing suicide because they literally couldn't get jobs because of some stupid joke they told on Twitter several years ago. Now, granted, that's not the technology's fault. That's a fault of human nature. And, my own presence in social media is very, very minimal. I just do what's necessary for the show. And for nothing else. So I agree with you to say, well, if they can't put you in prison, then you really need to chill out. Is it fair to say that there were times when, say, you want to do, some kind of blast on social media for your campaign or your fundraiser, and then it just gets yanked because reasons? I mean, there's more than anecdotal evidence that sort of thing has been happening. Isn't that correct?
Oh, absolutely. Media Research Center has a website. I think I'm getting it right. It's like censortrack.org, and they've compiled hundreds and hundreds of examples of these just since last year, and it's only stepped up. But we've been hearing about this for, it's not even a new phenomenon. It's really stepped up in the last few years. But, Apple was censoring Christian apps 10 years ago from their app store. I mean, this is, this kind of idea that the ideology of people who live in Silicon Valley should be supreme, and that anything that, goes against it should be removed because they have the power to do so. I think that's really dangerous. And it's, for myself as a conservative, I think it's dangerous with all of these arguments that we're trying to have. Like, we've made such gains on like the pro-life issue. We've shown some weaknesses with the gender ideology, with women's sports, and with men being put into women's prisons and all sorts of things. And, but if we're not allowed to communicate in the public square, if, every institution is lined up against us, we know the media is never going to give us a fair shake. Right. Ultimately, people's opinions will be changed because that's the nature of democracy. And so that's not democracy at all then. If you have only one viewpoint allowed in the public square, that's a much more authoritarian society, even though technically it might not be the government doing it.
And I want to add to that oftentimes as a result of media manipulation or hyper exaggeration or exaggerated vilification, then other services begin to kick in. For example, I think of Andrew Torba of Gab, who had his credit card canceled. Not only him, members of his family, or PayPal, withdraws services, or banks and so on. So you can. If you're kicked out into the wilderness without your laptop and your phone, a nice first world problem. I mean, you're pretty darn well isolated at that point. We have, for better for worse, we have set up a system of living in the West that if you don't have electronic access, you're in real trouble on a very practical level. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
Yeah. I mean, there's Rod Dreher wrote about the Benedict option, and I love Rod, but I think a lot of people characterize that book in different ways. But, the idea behind it being that we can retreat into our own enclaves and do that. I don't think that's really possible in 2021 if you want to impact your community and impact the people around you. So, maybe if you're, working, I don't know, at an insurance company or something like that, maybe you don't have to engage in the political stuff day to day. But if you're somebody who's an activist or a believer or, anything, and you want to have an impact on your community, these companies have the ability to prevent you from doing that. You brought up the financial services thing. This, to me, that's even scarier than the social media sites. But you have somebody like, who I don't agree with her on everything, but Laura Loomer in Florida ran for Congress last year, was completely removed from all the platforms, and even like Uber and Lyft and PayPal and all of these different banks wouldn't bank with her. And so what is she supposed to do? I don't think she has a family, but if she has a family, like, what is she supposed to do? Is she supposed to go out and get a job at one of these corporations who will Google her and then never hire her? I think you have circumstances like that where the power of these companies can really ruin lives. And so that's where I think we really need to consider something like a non-discrimination statute or, maybe a Civil Rights Act approach to this, because it honestly is oppressive.
Friends, I'm speaking with Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. We're talking about whether big tech is trying to play both sides. John, Robbie Suave in his article in Reason magazine, he ends, I just want to read you the last paragraph to get your take on it. He says, while liberals and conservatives can't agree on which side is supposedly receiving an unfair advantage from social media, they increasingly agree on the solution: break up big tech. He goes on to say, progressives like this approach because punishing big corporations for sheer bigness is a time-honored liberal tradition, and conservatives like this approach because it will make Mark Zuckerberg rue the day he crossed them. And he concludes, why anyone should expect Facebook's smaller successor companies to have superior moderation policies is never explained. What's your take on that last paragraph?
No, I think the answer is actually competition would help in this space, because ultimately if you had 10 Facebooks and, people wanted to have a platform where they could hear their friends' perspective, they'll go to the one that has free speech. And people self-sort. You would have people who are afraid of hearing that there are only two genders, maybe going to the one platform. But ultimately, I think competition, we believe this in America. We believe this in the free market. Competition yields better results for consumers. And unfortunately, the reason why I think those bills are very interesting in the House, and my organization has supported them, is because, we're talking about companies that have engaged in anti-competitive behavior. Facebook had Instagram coming as a potential competitor to it. I think Instagram might ultimately win that fight, but Facebook acquired them early, so it became, one company. And I think that's happening all the time. If you look at these mergers and acquisitions and all the other things, Amazon is notorious for really going after their competitors and taking away their ability to compete. Google has done that by Yelp is a competitor to Google. And so Google decided, hey, you know what? Everyone searches for Yelp on Google. What if we just created our own Yelp and suppressed Yelp? And, it's worked. It hurts, So I think, I just think that it's ultimately, he's wrong on that. And it's not just because we don't like Mark Zuckerberg. I don't have anything against Mark Zuckerberg. I just think that more competition would be better for speech and expression.
Well, we do talk about the free marketplace of ideas, and it does seem to me that people are voting with their feet. I know that relative to the size of Twitter, Gab is still rather small, but its growth rate is really astonishing. I know that Andrew Torba can't get servers fast enough, and there is a sense in which if you don't own it and control it yourself, you're going to be in trouble. Bill Willett has been a guest on the show, and he said, the great thing about the early blogosphere was your blog was yours. And then he said, and then everybody, without a great deal of thought, shifted over to YouTube and became really dependent upon YouTube for their business model. And YouTube, I think, is fair to say, is rather censorious at times. Mm-hmm. And I'm also concerned that people are going to self-censor so as not to run afoul of the thought police. What does self-censor do to a culture and to democracy?
Oh, it's absolutely happening here. I think we've seen plenty of evidence of that, where people feel that, okay, I can't express this idea if I want to continue to work at my job, or if I want to be perceived by the people who give me a raise as good. And so you'll see people not engage in politics, not engage in even basic things like evangelization, right? I think today at a Silicon Valley company, if you were a Catholic and were evangelizing to the wrong people, you could, risk your career over it. So self-censorship is the result of this ultimately, because of these societal pressures to conform. And ultimately, what does that do? Well, I think in the case of Christianity, we've seen throughout history that because it's truth, we will survive. It might actually end up being a net good for Christianity long term. But some of these other ideas, if you don't have them in the public square and be able to dial. They just disappear, and that's
Right.
kind of the Orwellian view of things. If you can't think a word, then the word disappears, and it's no longer an idea.
And I can't help but notice that with all these things going on in big tech and big media and so on, no one ever says, "Oh, we can't say that; it'll offend the Christians." And even more rare is, "Oh, no, we can't say that; it'll offend the Catholics." So, at the risk of seeming to ask for special pleading here, uh, you know, I represent a church that has something good to say to the world. I don't want that voice to be muffled. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. We're talking about big tech trying to play both sides. In the next segment, we're going to ask, well, what should we do next? Boycott, build your own platform, or something else? After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
The Station of the Cross thanks our financial supporters who have enabled us to broadcast Catholic programs for more than 20 years. As a nonprofit lay organization not affiliated with your diocese, our apostolate is listener-supported. Through your generosity, we're able to inspire countless listeners with the gospel message and help lead them to a parish to be spiritually nourished by the sacraments. Thank you for your continued support, and may God bless you and your family.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTeigue of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My guest today is Jon Schweppe. He's Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Principles Project. We're talking about big tech trying to play both sides. Jon, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you to tell us about the website bigtechfunding.org. Fill us in, please.
Yeah, so that is basically what we did was we created a kind of neat Google extension on the Chrome browser. So where if you're on Twitter and you have that downloaded, you can actually see fact checks under every user account that's funded by big tech. So we add to it pretty regularly. I think we're up to 400 accounts now on there. But if that's a little too much for your listeners, there are spreadsheets there where you can see which groups receive funding. It's a really useful resource. And so our goal with it has been really to push some of the media types to start reporting, when they quote someone from R Street Institute, which is funded to the tune of 7 figures by some of these companies, they need to be explaining in their description of this person that they work for a Google-funded think tank. And so that's kind of been the goal with it. It's been largely successful so far because, again, there's this really unique subset of left and right who are opposed to the concentrated power of these companies.
Can you give us some examples of, say, organizations who we wouldn't be surprised, say, receiving Google funds, and then organizations whom we might be surprised?
Yeah, I think, one of the weird things that's happened, it's been an outgrowth of the Tea Party movement, but a lot of these free market named think tanks have gotten in with these companies. I think in part, that was probably early on because they opposed regulation, they opposed all these different things. They were pro-growth, so it's kind of a natural partnership. But as the censorship has increased, I think that partnership becomes a little bit more unacceptable. And so you'll even hear groups like Americans for Tax Reform, which is a well-respected group, a group that's very important on a number of issues. But yes, they advocate against antitrust and to leave these companies alone entirely. And then there's groups like, I think Heritage Foundation might have surprised people for a long time that they did, but, ultimately they saw what happened and rejected the funding. And so now Heritage is actually publicly disavowing it, and they're out. They've put together an anti-big tech program, and so I think that's kind of where we need to be is pushing back on the organizations that are good organizations, but have kind of gotten into these what I would consider a kind of shady partnership, given these companies' impacts on our elections and speech and expression.
John, I've gone through your website, bigtechfunding.org, and we'll link to that in the show notes. And then there's the frequently asked questions. And there's one here that says, do you think everyone getting big tech money is a shill? What was your answer to that question?
I believe we put in a shrugging emoji.
Yes.
No, so I think the trick here is you have to understand that a lot of the people who advocate in this space are either kids right out of college or maybe a couple years out here, mid-20s. And I do believe a lot of them, most of them probably, believe what they say. But I think the thing here to understand is that they are platformed by these companies. Their salaries, their rent, this is all paid for by the companies. And so there's this natural inclination to, of course, they're going to side with them because that's, where their career's at right now. So I don't like calling people shills because I think, if you're going to say someone's being disingenuous, you better be able to prove it.
Right.
And it's not necessarily charitable, but ultimately what they are doing, whether they know it or not, is promoting a bottom line that these companies are asking them to promote.
I remember in college I wore a T-shirt and it showed a small fish being about to be swallowed by a larger fish, about to be swallowed by an even larger fish, and it kind of went backwards into infinity. And the words read, "There's no such thing as a free lunch." So for, say you've got an advocacy group, whether it's cultural, political, social, and they want to do the right things. And as you know, start an organization from scratch. The budget is rather thin. And then Google comes knocking at the door. What advice would you give for this young startup organization?
Well, I mean, that's tough because ultimately, it depends on what you're trying to advocate for. I could understand maybe considering taking the money if you weren't working in that space, but they will guide you back to that space. They'll have, as you said, there's no such thing as a free lunch. They're not just giving you the money to be charitable. So, I think you have to expect in Washington, no matter who it is, if they give you a grant, whether it's being an individual or a corporation or a foundation, they do expect a return on it. And so I think knowing upfront what that is and being explicit, and then determining for yourself if that, violates your principles or if it actually advances them. But, one of the things I find laughable is some of these guys from big tech funded organizations claim that, well, they're not told what to do. And that's just not how this works. Like anybody who's giving out six-figure grants is checking in to see what your deliverables are. This is just how, not even just Washington, D.C., but how nonprofits work. And so I think just being upfront about what the expectations are, and I would urge you personally, don't take Google money because they're a bad company.
Okay. And maybe, the first grant doesn't have very many strings attached. Isn't there a danger that you can become dependent on that funding? You don't have to do the hard work of fundraising, because Google's going to send us another check, and then Google sends us a check with a little hint or a suggestion, and then that begins to snowball. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, because I think, you get that first check and maybe you don't think there's expectations for it. And then say you get it in January of a fiscal year, and then it's November, December, and you're checking in to see if there's a second check coming, and, maybe they're asking you, okay, well, we need you to weigh in on this and lobby on this and write this op-ed and that op-ed. I know for a fact with Google, it's much more aggressive than that. It's from the outset. But, these are the types of things you do have to understand that people just don't give you money for free. And so what we've been really fortunate at APP, with our fundraising, we've had generous givers who just believe in our mission, whether it be fighting the crazy gender ideology, fighting big tech, fighting critical race theory in schools, that sort of thing. And there's an advantage to that because it gives you the freedom to continue to do the right thing rather than worry about where the money's coming from next year.
Well, when I was a little boy and I would, want a cookie that I shouldn't have, and I bat my eyes and try to look cute. I used to be able to do that when I was about 4, and then it stopped. She'd wag her finger and say to me in Italian, "Quando la diavolo la carezza vola la anima." When the devil caresses you, he wants your soul. Would you say that's good advice for young startup organizations when people come up with big fat checkbooks?
Yeah. Oh, no, definitely. I mean, I think that's and that would be true of any corporation. I think big tech is particularly problematic there. But, if any company is coming up to you wanting to give you money, it's because they think that they can achieve a positive return on that money because of the work you're doing. So you have to be able to be confident that this company, as you say, isn't the devil. Because
right.
Ultimately, you don't want to do that. And so I'm not saying, I think there are some fine American companies out there. And so we were explicit on that site not to condemn all corporate funding.
Right.
We even created an out for ourselves if a corporate source wanted to fund us. But, ultimately, we're going to do what we want to do. We're going to advocate on what we want to advocate. So we want these corporations to echo what we're doing, not try to drive it.
Jon Schweppe, the American Principles Project, thank you for a good conversation. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you so much, Father.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTighe, your host here every day at the Catholic Current. Join us tomorrow for Timely Tuesday. We welcome back Liz Yore, well-known child advocate, and we're going to be talking about government policies facilitating human trafficking. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Through the intercession of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, may Almighty God bless you, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Go in peace, and please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. If this podcast has helped you in your spiritual journey, please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.